This is the third lecture of our second week. It's the first of a pair of lectures about the definition of the term racism, right? So it's a sort of applied ethics, right? It's not exactly about what sort of actions we should or shouldn't do, um, but it is about a conceptual issue in an important field of applied ethics, of social ethics. And I think it's worth looking at. As I mentioned, I think at the end of the last lecture, I think this notion of institutional racism as distinct from the sort of racism where a particular person um, feels hatred for other races, I think these are gaining currency in the contemporary society. We're starting to understand the two different senses. So wanted to cover two different arguments for whether we should sort of think of racism as a more narrow phenomenon, and lots of other things that are related to race maybe shouldn't be called racism, or if we should think of racism more broadly and incorporate more things that in the past maybe wouldn't have been called racist, and point out that those are racist. So Lawrence Blum here is going to argue for the narrow version, and he's going to say that we should keep the term racism confined to a relatively narrow category of actions and things. There's various things that the term could be applied for, as we'll see, um, and that there's better other ways to deal with other race-related ills. Okay, well, this is just what I said. I guess Blum is going to argue that the term racism has expanded to cover too many distinct phenomena that are related to race. Um, he's going to argue we need a more fine-grained vocabulary, right? We need to carve this broad sort of race-related phenomena, we need to carve it up into sort of more distinct categories so that we can talk about it more effectively and address these issues more effectively. He thinks that that will, by narrowing the term racism to a range of activities, it's going to encourage more communication on the subject. We're going to feel more comfortable talking about race more openly, and we'll make more progress on actually addressing some of these problems. So Blum suggests that Americans have a hard time talking about race, right? And the discourse and ultimately, the solutions to these issues have suffered because of this difficulty around just communicating around race. He claims that in classrooms, students are often afraid of exposing their ignorance of other cultures, and they're afraid that they're going to say something that makes them appear racist. I mean, I don't know what's going on in people's heads, but often, right, when I'm teaching, people are often afraid to say anything on many subjects, right? So the more we can sort of remove inhibitions, right, that make them feel like they're going to be admonished or somehow scolded for whatever they say, is probably a good thing. There's also in the culture this sort of popular notion that we should be colorblind and sort of like just pretend like race doesn't exist, never don't notice or talk about race. But Blum thinks that's probably a bad idea. I mean, particularly for teachers, since we're talking about the classroom, this is one of our goals: diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And this is sort of the opposite of the colorblind approach. And it's like we need to keep in mind, right, the various struggles and backgrounds and histories of each of our students, and do our best to make sure that they all have what they need to succeed in the classroom, right, given their various differences. Now, Blum says that, just as people don't want to appear ignorant or racist, other people don't want to have to educate their peers about their own lives and identities, right? So you don't necessarily have to feel like you're the spokesman for your race either. And since the discourse can be sometimes dominated in the U.S., at least by the history of Black people in the U.S., because there's, as we've seen, particularly egregious forms of oppression and discrimination, he says that oftentimes, like Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans may feel unsure about how they sort of fit into this discourse on race. And figuring that out requires talking about it, right? So these are just a few of the problems that come up talking about race. So Blum wants to sort of focus in on one issue, which is the meaning of the term racism. So he points out that almost no one in our society these days considers themselves racist or wants to be seen as racist. And this fear of appearing racist can sometimes create a good deal of inhibition when talking about race. Um, my head is over it, but the picture is some like a Trump supporter, and they're holding a shirt that says Trump and Republicans are not racist, right? And this is, you saw this, lots of people thought that Trump was pretty clearly racist. He seemed to be sort of pushing those buttons in the campaign, but he himself and many of his supporters would say, no, I'm the least racist person in the room. So even uh, anyways, point being, right, from on a broad spectrum, people typically do not want to identify as racist, right? People that do is pretty a small subculture. Um, so part of this fear about appearing racist um, may come from a sort of vagueness that's developed around the term racism, and Blum thinks a little conceptual analysis could maybe help clarify things, help this discussion make people feel more comfortable about talking about race and getting to work problems. It's obviously not going to solve all the racial problems in the U.S. There's some real hardcore material issues that need to be addressed. It's not just a conceptual issue, but conceptual issues happen to be what philosophers are good at. It is one thing that needs doing. So that is his task that he's going to take on. So first, sort of a quick survey of some of the ways that the term racist is used in contemporary society, and these are all taken from the news. He doesn't cite specifically what news broadcasts, but um, example, is television racist? Asks a news article, right? That's talking about the lack of minority actors in lead roles. Apparently, an article where black people who have supported a white mayoral candidate over a black one being called racist. Um, a white student claiming that it's racist for her black teacher to wear African clothing. Um, schools and sports teams getting rid of logos that represent Native Americans or red headdresses. That practice has been called racist as well. So just a quick sort of broad sample of like, there's lots of ways that the term racism gets used. And so the question is the term overused, right? Has it become too broad? Um, Blum thinks it has become sort of a very general term that just picks out any sort of racial malfeasance, right? Or he'll call them racial ills, right? Um, he says it's reached the level of generality of the term cruel, right? Just nobody really wants to admit to being cruel. Same way nobody would admit to being racist. It's a very general term for a bad type of person. So he wants to question whether all of those instances on that previous slide are actually racism. Um, and just sort of as a side note, there's a whole other issue on whether race is even a thing, right? So when we say someone is Asian, right, there's a couple ways to understand that. A lot of people think that that word doesn't actually correspond to any sort of genetic or inherited um, trait, right? And that it has more to do with like a social construct, like a group of people who have been sort of treated a certain way under certain political regimes. It's called sort of a racialized group. Uh, that's the way some people prefer to think of it. Then race is some sort of inherited genetic thing. We don't really have time to get into that, right? But I did want to flag that. We're going to be talking about race as if it exists, but a lot of people think it doesn't. Okay, so once again, just sort of setting it up, pushing like so. If we have this binary concept, right, this real broad category of racism, and then everything else is not racist, right? And if we're lacking the fine sort of distinctions that Blum wants to argue we should have within the category of racial ills, um, you run into some problems, right? So, are the following things racist? You may have wondered this yourself sometimes, right? Referring to someone's race, right? You say, oh yeah, oh, do you know my friend Jerry? Yeah, he's like 5'10", black, and you think, oh, should I have said that Jerry's black, right? Um, I thought that, right? How when you're describing people, right? Um, is using the wrong term for someone's race, right? Is that racist? People often worry about this. In literature, often black is still used, often African American is used, and it's not always clear which is preferred. Right? The example he uses is Oriental. That's my mom would use that term instead of Asian, and maybe that was the right the appropriate term at the time, or the one that folks mostly used. I don't know. I grew up Asian was the term. Um, Only having friends from your own racial group. Are you racist, right? If you don't have any Latino friends, um, seems like right the cast of friends all pretty white, right? They seem to pretty much hang out together all the time. So are they racist? Um, and you know, different people may have different intuitions on this, right? Blum's open to that, but he's thinking that at least in some of these cases, you might be inclined to say they're not these aren't necessarily good things or awesome things, but it might feel a bit strong to call them racist, right? At least that's the intuition he's trying. So Blum uses another example to point this out, right? So this is I'm not aware of this story, but he's talking about an actual thing that happened, right? It was this is within like kind of within a police department, an incident, right, that had to get investigated. I guess a police officer hung a noose from the seat, like the motorcycle, of a fellow officer who was black. And so they did an internal investigation, and apparently they found no racism, right? I guess, and I don't know the details. It was like a joke about something that happened to be totally unrelated. Um, well, it's hard to say this was a good thing, right? Anybody with any sense and a knowledge of history should know the implications of hanging a noose, right, from a black person's motorcycle. Um, it seems like a bad thing to do. But again, Blum wants to say, okay, well, at least according to this investigation, they decided it wasn't racist. It's not good. Does it have to be one of those two things, right? Or can there be a middle ground where it's racially related and it's a bad thing to do, but maybe not racist? And this is precisely, again, Blum wants to say not all racial incidents, right? Racial ills are necessarily going to be racist incidents. Um, Says, here's a good quote. Not every instance of racial conflict, insensitivity, discomfort, miscommunication, exclusion, injustice, or ignorance should be called racist. Thinks there should be a more nuanced vocabulary, and that's not at all to say that if it isn't racist, it's not an issue of moral concern, right? Um, Racial insensitivity, discomfort, etc. Those are bad things. He just wants to say they're not racist things. Another example, right? And again, this is a real example apparently. Uh, there's an incident where it's a soccer team and one of the teammates says, "Boy, hey boy, pass the ball over here." But the person he's talking to is a black teammate. Um, Again, don't ever call a black person boy, right? This has all kinds of historical implications if you're not aware, right? Um, Particularly in the South, right? It was a sort of an infantilization of black people, and it was a way to sort of keep them down. So we do not say that anymore. Um, so you shouldn't call black people boy. The reasons definitely have to do with race, racial history, but it seems hard to say that that 9-year-old was racist. I don't think he had that history in mind. Um, so again, he's pushing your intuitions to say maybe we need more categories, right? Racist and not. Another example are policies that have racially unjust effects, but maybe didn't arise from racial motives, right? So there are school meal programs, they've been around for a long time, and at least the default when I was in elementary school and stuff is as much milk as they possibly can, right? They really thought milk was going to solve all of your nutritional problems. Problem is, African American people are more likely have a higher probability of being lactose intolerant, right? So that doesn't really seem to be very sensitive to differences among right people with different racial backgrounds. Um, the racial makeup of a cast on a television show, once again, Friends, right? These um, Joey and Chandler are turning out to be maybe not so good on race, huh? Uh, and then simply being sort of ignorant of the racial issues affecting your coworker. These are all, again, bad things, bad policies, and we should fix them, right? But again, maybe Blum wants to say they shouldn't count as even jokes, right? So jokes can be racist, but he's saying, does telling the joke mean you're a racist? Um, in the sense of like holding some pervasive sort of racial animosity or inferiorizing attitudes towards some racial group. We'll get more into that. He's sort of previewing what his definition of racism is going to be. But he's saying you can tell a basically he's saying you can tell a racist joke in certain circumstances, but it may not mean that you have racism in your heart, I guess. Maybe you're acting in a play, right? Maybe the character makes a racist joke. Maybe you're trying to get along with your in-laws and your in-laws are a little racist and you're laughing at the racist joke, right? Maybe you're in a biker bar and you're just terrified of getting beaten up, right? By a bunch of, I don't know, Nazi skinheads or something. So like you tell a racist joke so they will think you're okay so you can get out of there. I don't know. Again, he's not saying it's okay to tell racist jokes anytime as long as you don't have racism in your heart. But again, there's more situations than can really be captured by the term racist. All right, and he thinks this joke issue brings up something important, which is a distinction between your intention in an action or a communication or something and the effect that it has, right? So this has been a thing in the past, right? So people will do like maybe a fraternity. I think this poster is from sort of the gay community, some sort of fundraiser in, I don't know the area actually. But you can have, this is a thing that happens. They'll have charity auctions. What they do is they do a little slave auction. And so you sort of bid to have some person, and they're not usually necessarily black people, right? Let's say they're white pledges to their fraternity or something. But then for a day, they come to your house and they clean your bathroom and stuff, and it raises money for a charity or whatever. That obviously makes light of the history of slavery. It demeans African Americans. But maybe, right, the people that put on that charity auction had sort of no idea. That was not their intention. It never occurred to them, right? Is it their responsibility to have it occur to them? Maybe, maybe not, right? But stipulate for the moment that their intentions were pure, right? And they had no idea. Regardless, right, the effect is going to be demeaning, right? And being ignorant of it doesn't seem to reduce the moral culpability of having done something with a sort of demeaning or racist effect. But still, the question is, well, does it make the person racist, right? Maybe if they found out that it was interpreted that way, they would feel terrible, right? And they would want to make it right. So can also be this distinction. To what does racism apply? People, practices, jokes. There's lots of different types of things that can be labeled racist. Okay. So now he's going to get into his definition of racism. So he spent a fair amount of time, about half the paper, sort of trying to sort of loosen up this conceptual apparatus in your brain to say, well, maybe we need a better, right? Maybe we need to work on defining this a little better. So here's his what he's offering as a definition, and he's saying now, of course, the definition I'm going to give, it might not actually capture the concept that everybody's operating with, right? And I mean that's part of his point, is that the concept has been inflating, but he does think that there is a core meaning to racism, and that he's going to try to capture that core meaning. A little historical aside, right? He thinks that that core meaning sort of developed in Nazi Germany, and it was explicitly a theory of racial superiority. It then spread to other places with similar systems of racial subjugation, like the South African apartheid regime. And he thinks this core racism, that was as it kind of historically originated, and what he thinks we should more or less return to as what racism should mean, has two important themes to it: inferiorization and antipathy. Right? So inferiorization meaning you think that, right, other people, someone is less than you in some way, right? And antipathy, hatred, ill feeling towards them. Okay, so yeah, inferiorization is treating the racial other as inferior, and racial antipathy is a strong dislike or hostility towards someone because of their race. These two things are totally conceptually distinct. You can have one without the other. You could think someone is inferior without hating them, and you can hate someone without thinking they're inferior. So the first one was pretty common in like pre-Civil War South, right? If you were a slaveholder, some of them believed that the slaves needed to be taken care of, needed to be sort of ruled over, and didn't necessarily hate them, right? At least it's conceptually possible, right? I don't know any of these slave owners, so I can't say if they all also hated them. But in any rate, that's one part of the two, right? The two parts that make up racism for him. Just this belief in the inferiority of some other race. And you can hate someone for their race without believing they're inferior, right? So there's people, right? There's anti-Semites that hate Jews because they think they're so rich and powerful and control Hollywood or whatever, right? People might hate Asians because they're just so smart and industrious and they right, get into Harvard or something. Again, stereotypes is not my thing. Or you might hate black people because they have excel in so many high prestige areas, acting, music, sport. I don't think anybody, Jimi Hendrix, I don't think anybody thinks Jimi Hendrix is an inferior guitar player. Possibly the best guitar player that ever existed, right? But that doesn't mean you might not hate them. You might not hate him because of his race. So the two themes, of course, they do support and interact with each other. So if you're a member of a racial group and you're not accepting the status of inferiority, that can spur hatred, right? And it can be this self-enforcing cycle, right? And this is often when lynchings occurred, right? Is when after the Civil War, typically before and even during the Civil Rights era, when people were fighting for their rights, often that refusal to accept the inferior status caused hatred, and then people murdered them. So what then? So let's accept Blum's account for now. Core racism, inferiorization, I have to keep saying that, or antipathy, right? So if we accept that, what ends up being racist and what ends up not being racist? So Blum has some ideas about it. And this part is a little confusing to me, to be honest. These next two slides, I'm not quite sure I follow Blum. So you could write a paper explaining it to me, right? Defending him, or you could write a paper. Sometimes when you're like, this doesn't make sense to me, it's because it's wrong, and that's sometimes a bell goes off, says here's a paper topic, right? So yeah, I'm definitely a little fuzzy on these next two. So maybe this is an area for paper topics. But so some stereotypes, like seeing other racial groups as intellectually inferior, obviously will be racist. But there's other things that are a little hard to say. So if you say black people are good dancers, is that racist in Blum's sense? It's definitely a stereotype, right? It denies the individuality of black people by sort of just saying they all have this certain characteristic. And it also has this historical resonance in America where black people were often praised for their physical prowess and not so much for their intellectual ability. Here's Tina Turner, great dancer, obviously. So Blum says, yeah, it might be a racist stereotype in a sense, right? Even though it doesn't necessarily explicitly have the inferiorizing. It's saying a good thing, right? It's saying they're not inferior, and it's not necessarily antipathy. You're not saying you hate the person. You're just saying they're a good dancer. But it does cohere with an explicitly racist stereotype. So he says it might be racist. That's a little confusing for me. It seems to not fit his definition, and yet he seems to, I think, be saying that it is nonetheless racist. Maybe you can help sort that out in discussion or in a paper. And then he suggests that other stereotypes of racial groups that are bad, even though they're bad, and so as far as they're negative, they may not be racist because they're not connected with this historical theory of inferiorization. And he suggests that the stereotype of Asians as bad drivers might not be racist, which struck me as odd. I kind of thought of that as pretty racist. This photo is, I haven't watched these movies, but character in Fast and Furious 9, obviously a very good driver, right? So Yeah, I'm having a little trouble holding this distinction in my mind. He seems to be now have maybe three parts to it, and then right, it has to be inferiorizing, antipathy, and be connected with some sort of historical um, uh, race and history of inferiorization. I'm not sure. I feel like he's not entirely clear. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean it couldn't be made clear. And maybe you can work on that. So, what would race, given this now sort of fuzzy definition, right? But we kind of get the idea. Um, what might some what might be some racial ills that actually turn out not to be racist, right? So here's his example. So fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Verano or Ms. Verano, um, and she doesn't think African Americans are inferior. She doesn't hold any antipathy towards them, but she just has no experience with black people, black culture, whatever. She was raised in a white neighborhood and just didn't encounter black people. I guess didn't watch TV. Um, so according to this is a made-up story, right? So according to this made-up story, she feels uncomfortable around her black students' parents. She has trouble communicating with them, right? And since she feels uncomfortable and has trouble sort of holding these conversations with the parents, she can't really serve the students as well. Um, and Blum wants to say that's not racism. She's not racist. Um, it's a bad situation. It's a bad thing. We don't want it to happen. We would like her to serve her black students as well as she does the other ones. But he thinks it would be conceptual inflation to call her racist. Um, he thinks a better term, a better concept would be something like racial discomfort or racial anxiety is what she has, right? So more on racial anxiety. So here is Blum. He's narrowed down the category of racist, and now he's starting to sort of fill in the blanks of the conceptual space that used to be covered by racist, right? Now racist is just this much, so we got to fill in, okay, well, what are these other things? So racial anxiety is a start on that, right? He says racial anxiety is a pretty common thing in the United States. Now, one form it could take is that you're anxious that your actual racism will be revealed and people will know you're racist. Okay, well, that's racism, right? That's a racist person. Um, but in a lot of other cases, he says it's not going to be racist. You've just recognized that a group of people is different from you in some way. You feel anxious. You're not going to know how to interact with them, right? Are they going to like me? Will I say something embarrassing because I'm sort of ignorant of them and that group in general, right? Um, and that's going to be exacerbated by the fact that you're aware that race is a socially charged sort of concept, and you, you do the wrong thing, you might be labeled as a racist, right? So it's going to make you more anxious. So Blum says um, racial anxiety is not like shouldn't be the subject of moral condemnation, right? We shouldn't come down on people for feeling anxious in that way. It's something we should want to fix, right? It'll have bad effects, right? It can make you less good at your job if you can't interact comfortably with people of other races. Um, it's also going to prevent racial harmony more generally, right? It's just going to that anxiety is going to make it hard for you to get to know and make friends with people from other racial groups. And then it's going to make people around you nervous, right? They're going to wonder if you're racist. Why is he acting weird? Is he racist, right? So racial anxiety, a bad thing. It's just not racism, right? It's something we should eliminate. But according to Blum, it doesn't mean you're racist, but it's something you got to work on. One more sort of race-related ill that Blum thinks is again distinct from racism. So his example is suppose you're in a classroom, right, and there's a Haitian American girl in the class, and she's maybe one of only two black students in the classroom. And so when we start talking about race in the course, let's say it's an ethics course, the teacher keeps going right to the girl and says, "Hey, you want to enlighten us on the black point of view on this topic, right?" That's wrong. It's wrong for a few reasons, right? It doesn't distinguish Haitian Americans from other groups, right? It just sort of lumps them in as black. Um, and also, it just doesn't recognize the individuality of that student apart from her racial identity, right? Um, she has her views, right? They're not necessarily going to coincide with the black point of view, whatever that is, even if such a thing exists. Um, but again, Blum, on Blum's account of racism, he doesn't think the teacher is thinking that the student is inferior anyway or harbors any animosity towards her, right? So it's not racism. It's something else. It's another kind of bad thing that's related to race. All right, one last example, and I think this is a real one. There's two officers, right? So they're intervening in an altercation, right? Guns drawn. Um, and there's an off-duty black cop, so plain clothes, right? Who's also at the scene. His gun's drawn. So the uniformed officers tell the off-duty plainclothes officer, put down your gun, and he doesn't, right? Because he's a cop and he thinks he's helping, and so they shoot him. They don't know he's a cop. Well, when they find out that he was a police officer, and in fact, it turns out that one of them actually knew him, right? But is, I guess, in the situation he or something. I mean, they're genuinely remorseful, right? Seems pretty obvious that there's something or some kind of unconscious bias going on, right? Where like he didn't even recognize a guy he knows, probably because they're black, right, and not in a uniform, and they have a gun. We've seen more and more that there's this kind of bias, and it seems to be a huge problem in police departments. But Blum wants to question whether those officers are racist, right? They did genuinely feel terrible, right, when they found out the situation, and I guess normally, if you tell someone to put down their gun and they don't, at a certain point they do shoot you, for right or wrong. That's sort of the standard procedure, right? So, the officer racist? Is the racism is it more properly applied to sort of stereotypes, the unconscious biases that they have? If it's the latter, then like a racist stereotype is bad, right? It's about as bad as racism. It's killing people, right? But Blum wants to say it's maybe a different thing, right? Not racism, other racist ill, also very, very bad racist ills exist. Racial ills, not racist ills. All right, so summarizing, Blum wants to argue we should keep the term racism restricted to cases of racial animosity and inferiorization. Other racial ills are bad, should be addressed, but he thinks that calling them racist really just hinders our attempt to address them. And if we had a more fine-grained conceptual scheme, we'd make actually more progress on addressing it. All right, the next article is going to be arguing that we should keep actually the concept racism, keep it more broad, and that instead we should sort of carve it up in different ways so that some forms of racism are just shouldn't receive as much moral opprobrium as other forms. So a different way of carving up the concept.